Hi, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Future Tech podcast series. It's me, Charlie Sell, the Group MD for Arrows Group, where I'm interviewing CTOs, CIOs, thought leaders within the technology space. The podcast is aimed at STEM graduates with our partner universities, and you'll get to hear a bit about the story of the people we're interviewing, thoughts on emerging technologies, and the age-old question of career advice whilst listeners are thinking about your next role. So great pleasure to have Paul Bateman with me today. Paul is CTO at Informa. Informa is one of the largest events companies in the world. They're a knowledge-based events business globally, and with a lot of reach. So Paul, I can imagine, has seen a hell of a lot of change and seen quite a bit over the time. So welcome to the show, Paul.
Thanks, Charlie. Nice to be here. Hello, everyone.
Yeah, good. So let's cram straight into the first question and hear a bit about your story. How did you get into technology?
Well, I did an engineering degree many years ago, and about that time there was this thing called the dot-com boom, which made it sound really interesting to get into websites. And part of my final year dissertation and projects that I did actually allowed me to develop a database-driven web platform using some very basic sort of ASP technology. But believe it or not, that was quite niche at the time, and not many people actually knew things like HTML and knew how to plug a database into a web front end. So after getting that little bit of grounding through uni, I then, after a brief stint of having a little consultancy, got a real job for Informa. And part of my first kind of couple of years worth of experience was developing their first e-commerce platform. So we took content from what was then legacy magazines, converted it into HTML or XML, put it into a CMS, which we sort of had to write a subscription engine that sat on top of, and then allow people to access the content and deliver it, which actually we're talking about the 2000s, early 2000s, that was quite different to what other people were doing. At that time, people were just starting their digitization journey and trying to get their first websites out. So we were sort of a little bit ahead of the curve in that.
Fantastic. And so through Informa, what's been the career path?
So started as a developer, did senior developer, then I was technical architect for one of the bits of the business for a little while, then solution architecture, and then I went to work on a group project for a little while. I ran a testing and QA practice for a group initiative, and then did a little bit of project management, and somehow that combination of being quite technical but having ability to drive a plan was quite useful. So I was then brought in to rescue a failing SAP implementation for a part of the business, and that was my first sort of grounding in ERP, which was quite an experience, because I'd sort of come up through that sort of development background, quite an agile sort of ways of working, although Agile was only pretty new. In fact, it didn't really exist when I started. And then being exposed to what was really old school ERP technology was quite insightful as to, how other parts of the business needed to run, and that sort of very waterfall delivery pattern. And actually recognizing that quite often when projects run for a couple of years, you really aren't building for the future. You're actually building, you take a requirement, and then by the time you deliver it, actually the business has moved on. And certainly with Informa, it's been on quite a growth journey over the time I've been here. And that's a lesson that I've learned quite hard a number of times, actually. The length of time that you take between capturing requirements and then delivering something can really see you delivering the wrong stuff. So I did that for a little while, and then I was made director of the SAP environment, so I ran that globally for the business. then I started to expand the portfolio of applications. So went from SAP and then started running Salesforce and a whole variety of different core business applications, and expanded that portfolio as the business grew. Did a number of implementations of things like the ERPs as well as Salesforce and line of business sales systems. And then eventually, after probably, what's it now, about 13 years at plugging away, I got made CTO, and ran the enterprise application group for 3 years, and then was made CTO of one of the divisions about 4 or 5 years ago now. So slightly changing remit, as I had a sort of a divisional focus. So trying to look at the strategy for that division and more on aligning specifically how that division is operating to, and the technology, how it's operating to the divisional strategy. And yeah, in that course of that time, Informa has grown from, I think we entered the FTSE 100 about 5 or so years ago. We had a number of strategic growth initiatives. All of them had big technology components, which allowed me an opportunity to experiment and play with different technologies, different architectures, and build teams. I think that's the bit that I've enjoyed most, is building teams, global teams for delivery and making them as effective as I can.
Yeah. Well, and that's fantastic, especially, and we'll come on to the building teams, because that's exactly what our listeners are probably, will be really keen to know what you look for when building teams, and what they can do to put themselves in the best position possible. But what's also interesting about your story, I think, is that you can stay with a company for a period of time if you're continually moving and progression, isn't it? And it's clear that with your journey with Informa, you've gone through multiple levels, multiple gears, and you've been able to grow with the business. Because I think one of the things people get wrong is if they stay still too long, then they're not developing. And continuous learning, I think, is probably one of the most important things for anyone.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. And I think challenging yourself and a little bit of time for retrospection and looking and seeing how you're succeeding, or what the opportunities to have done things better, is really important in how you sort of develop your own career. And you will all eventually work on projects that don't go to plan, and it's amazing what you can learn from taking the good stuff out of those. And certainly some of the big initiatives that I've worked on or ran over the years, actually you probably learn more sometimes when it doesn't all pan out successfully. It's not to say you want to make your career full of failure, but don't be afraid to look back and find the positives within that, and look at how you could do better next time. I think certainly some of my greatest learnings have been through those sorts of periods. And you put yourself out and into challenging situations. I think some people naturally want to experiment with different delivery methods, experiment with different technologies, and I think that, as you say, continual learning is such an important attribute to anybody today. I mean, if you look at when 20 years ago when I came into the group, the fact that we really didn't have, we had a few marketing websites, but it wasn't really marketing as we know it today. You didn't really know that much about what people did on a website, other than you could get traffic figures that said we had 10,000 visitors. You didn't know where they clicked or how they clicked or what happened. And actually, I remember writing some code to help us track, this is the days before sort of double click and ad tracking. Actually allowed us to track what people were doing on the websites and how they navigated around websites. And that bit of data and that bit of insight allowed us to refine the user journeys. And, today that sounds like a noddy kind of obvious thing to do, but back in 2003, 2004, not many people were doing those sorts of things. So the way that we did it and the way that I did it was all about learning, continually pushing myself to learn either new languages when I was technical or much more technical than today, or new, architectural patterns, or new delivery mechanisms. I touched on Agile earlier, and Agile's been a fantastic thing for us to increase the sort of throughput of the teams and velocity, but it doesn't fit every scenario. And you get agile evangelists today who wouldn't like to listen to me saying, actually, if you know a direct path to deliver something, the most efficient way is waterfall.
Yeah.
If you don't know where you need to end up, if you don't know the outcome you're trying to drive for, then agile is by far the best mechanism to get there. But those little bits of learning are so important, and experimenting, and you only find the right sort of fit for each project through those learnings and experimentation.
Yeah, gosh, well, I couldn't agree with you more there. And it's great that you've been able to give sort of real life examples where you can, the whole agile versus waterfall debate at times. And you're right, agile is by far the most common and popular. And if you don't know the end journey, I totally agree with you. It's the way of not making huge mistakes because you can pick them up so much earlier. If you've got that direct path, waterfall is clearly the way. And it was nice that you mentioned earlier as well that one of the advantages of being with Informa, where you've either bought or merged with new companies, is you've been really able to look at different architectures, different technology, and so using that, I'm thinking about our next question, which is what excites you about emerging technology? Is there can you, looking at what you guys might be doing in the future or what you personally spend your time looking at, what's your thoughts on the emerging technology?
Well, I think for me, the most exciting thing today is in the sort of data and using data to really understand either the customer journey or the prospect journey. Informa is in large part a sales and marketing organization. We deliver products, whether it be a physical event or a academic journal or a business intelligence sort of data set. But actually a bit of getting people to that point of understanding what we want them to buy or what they'd like to buy, I think is fascinating. And the insight that you can capture through understanding the data around that, I think is, all the big players at the moment, it's that data-driven economy. It's the customer as the product, and building out sort of the different data points across those customers and contacts and that sort of thing to be able to understand their needs and wants better. And you apply some of that learning about how you can harvest the information to other areas. We have big data sets about clinical trial data, very topical at the moment. We're tracking all of the different trials around COVID and the different statuses of those trials. But you might, in the news today, I was reading about the fact that certainly in the UK, we haven't managed to get all of the raw materials lined up to be able to deliver some of the vaccines when we eventually get creative vaccine. So what we've got in Informa is data around not just shipping and commodities movements, but also manufacturing insight and who's building what factories from some of our harvesting. Imagine you can actually join quite a lot of dots together there if you put that in a big data warehouse, data lake or whatever, and start to think about what new insight could I drive from that. Could we have known this was going to happen well before because we actually looked at the planning applications and looked at the commodities movements? It didn't wait for a car crash to get there of us not recognising that we couldn't ship a vaccine that we've created. Actually, we could have known that 6-9 months ago because of the lead time to build all this stuff. Now, we didn't, and that's kind of history, right? But actually the data's there. And I think that the really fascinating bit now is that the technology platforms are there, enable us to support those sorts of big bits of insight that perhaps before we couldn't. I mean, this is not about stitching together old school physical databases. This is disparate data sources on a variety of different platforms, but there's a necessity or a need or an opportunity to stitch them together. And so I think as skills and technology develop, I think that's going to be a massive area for us because we'll be able to get and derive insight in ways that we've never thought of before.
Yeah, I think you've really hit a nail on the head with data being now just so accessible with cloud infrastructure and to be able to host it and support it. It's how you use it, isn't it? And do you have any thoughts on ethics behind it, though? Because I suppose one of the topical questions is with this amount of data now in the world and how to use it, and obviously there's the common good, which is helping the medical world and how to cure diseases even. But there's also an argument about data ethics, isn't it? How it can be misused by companies now it's so accessible. Have you come across any scenarios there?
Massively. I think certainly from a consumer point of view, I think that the sort of data ethics is a massive problem for us. And you know, I attended an event, it was a few years ago actually, and they were talking about sort of the different governance models evolving in the world now, and you know, compounded probably by Brexit and by the sort of US-China trade war that's sort of emerging. But actually, you know, you could quite easily see segmentation around the sort of ability to manage and manipulate and harvest data in the different areas of the world. Europe will have its sort of GDPR-based legislation and quite tightly governed within that economic zone, and the US will probably have its own, and probably China will have another one. And you see sort of a barriers that we probably haven't experienced before around how we can ship and model data around the organisations and around the world. You know, I think personally, am I worried about my kids using Facebook and the insight that can glean about them? Yeah, I am. Do I think there's much we can do about it? Probably not, because I think the value that people derive out of it, maybe not Facebook, but certainly things like Amazon, you know, is so beneficial to us. I think it's a compromise that a lot of people will be willing to exceed. But I think it should be a deliberate compromise, and I think that's the point at the moment, is perhaps it's not deliberate enough, and there isn't enough recognition about the implications of sharing data, having, you know, Alexa sitting on your bedside table knowing, or maybe not knowing, but sort of somehow harvesting some insight into what you do and the usage patterns of your central heating, and knowing when you're in the house and not in the house. I mean, there's some very personal data that's being harvested without probably enough acknowledgement of people.
Yeah.
Well, as I say, I think legislation is going to be difficult to implement to control this, and I think with the socio-economic climate we're seeing evolve now, it's going to be actually much harder, because, you know, as a global business, we're UK headquartered, so we've historically been keeping our data in Europe. But does that mean that our Chinese business needs to have its local data harvested or managed in a Chinese data center? Quite possibly in the future, and certainly some of our thinking around IT operating models are designed to better support that, because I can see a time when we can't just ship information around. But, you know, you flip that on top of the benefits of being able to use global data sets and drive insight from it, and there's some compromise to be made. And I don't see answers emerging to that at the moment.
Yeah. Well, that's a really well articulated point, because I think, you know, it is topical, but you're right. It's more about just acknowledgement and permission rather than the positive and negative impacts. So leading on to the last question then, thinking around, you know, you've said one of the things you're most passionate about is building teams and seeing that happen. So, well, again, with our listeners who, you know, a lot of them are going to be thinking about either their first job or they're recently graduated, what couple of pieces of advice would you give a graduate when they're about to enter the job market to really help them on their journey?
I think, you know, communication is so important. We are by nature very social beings, and actually in technology, we're not necessarily the best communicators. And I think any time an opportunity you get to develop those skills, whether it be through working in a team or whether it be through engagement in, you know, social activities or whatever, I think building out almost a persona that's willing to engage, I think is very, very important. I subscribe to a sort of a coaching mentality, and I don't micromanage teams, and I try to give people breathing space to be successful and sort of steer gently from the outside, as it were. And I think when you work for good leaders, you can take things away from them, and when you don't work for good leaders, it can be a real inhibitor to not just to your growth but to your development. And I know it's difficult when you're going into job interviews and that sort of thing to be able to spot who could you work with well. But I think that natural inclination of, did I really bond with somebody in an interview? Did I actually manage to form a human connection. And I know it's very difficult sometimes in interviews, especially, when more of them are going to be virtual or, not face to face. But I do think that sort of the human connection is very important in developing good teams. And it's not easy to do necessarily. I mean, quite a lot of my teams are distributed globally, and you have to deal with different nuances of culture, as well as time zone. But even with that said, you get to know quite quickly the people who you want to talk to. And there's a sort of an instinct around that. And that's developed through millions of years of evolution. It's not something that you naturally can pin a hat on, but it's something that I've found very, very useful. And using that sort of instinctive communication that we've all got. And as I say, if you can sort of develop that and that ability to engage with people face to face, I think that's really, really useful. And certainly it's something that's helped me in my career. The other thing, as sort of most of you, if you moved into a technology world now, starting in a lot of roles, you'd be working in a Scrum or an Agile team, which encourages, cross-pollination of knowledge and sharing, and a common trajectory. And I think that's actually quite good for nurturing, more junior colleagues in how they can do well. But, you need to learn from all the people around you. Every opportunity to kind of be inquisitive, to sort of go a little bit further in understanding, what does that mean? Ask a question, why? The people who are most inquisitive and then willing to sort of learn from what they've found, I think, are the people who are more likely to succeed. Certainly in the more technical roles, you do get people who are with a great affinity to go and experiment and look and find and teach themselves new ways of solving problems. And the world needs to be built on, the world will succeed in having those sorts of inquisitive minds out there. I think that's a big opportunity for people.
Yeah, well, and again, great advice. That be inquisitive, the continuous learning, and embrace. Like you said, Agile does really facilitate that cross-pollination and cross-learning. But you've got to be open to it, don't you? And then practice those communication skills, even if it's not, even if you're not a natural extrovert, but to be able to draw on that when you need to is a great piece of advice. So, Paul, thank you. That's been a really, really interesting view of both your career, but equally the thoughts on data, specifically emerging technology, and your advice to the listeners. So thank you for your time. I hope you've enjoyed it.
Yeah, no, it's been good. Hopefully everyone's taken something away from that. But thanks, Charlie.
Yeah, great. So to everyone listening, that's another episode of the Future Tech podcast series. It's going to be posted on the career portals of our partner universities, along with our Spotify channel, which will be linked at the bottom of the LinkedIn clips. So until next time, thank you everyone, and enjoy yourself.